Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, and regulatory landscape and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me this afternoon, we have Pelle Braendgaard, co-founder and CEO of Notabene, Tiffany Smith, partner and co-chair of the Blockchain and Cryptocurrency Working Group at WilmerHale, and Cleve Mesidor, founder of National Policy Network of Women of Color in Blockchain. We're here to discuss the future of digital assets and securities regulation and enforcement. It is great to have all of you with us. Let's get some quick background here. Pelle, we'll start with you. Tell us about the work that you're doing within the digital asset and compliance space.
Yeah, so we are helping companies around the world, crypto native companies and also more traditional financial services, operate and transact compliantly with stable coins and other kinds of crypto assets. We work closely with regulators, but also really on helping companies address the needs, like the requirements. There's this new regulatory clarity globally. So we talk with companies all over the world who are getting their licenses, getting licensed, implementing new guidelines, and really joining the global financial system.
Right. And Tiffany, tell us about the work that you're doing at WilmerHale as it relates to Web3 crypto emerging technology companies.
Sure. So I first help those companies navigate the regulatory landscape and understand the regulations that could apply to their business. And then when there's an SEC or state enforcement action, I help them defend off those actions.
Right. And Cleve, give us some of your background in the work that you're doing within Web3 and DeFi policy.
Yes, I work at the intersection of public policy and blockchain. I focus on education and access. I've been working in this space for over 6 years, coming from Washington politics. I worked in Congress and served in the Obama administration. And I focus on making sure that policymaking is inclusive, but also making sure that the public has access to trusted content from reputable sources. And certainly over the last 6 years, we've seen this landscape change so much. So I'm excited to dive into this conversation.
Yeah, and let's start right there for Cleve, just to kick off the conversation. What do you think is in store when it comes to DeFi and Web3 policy? Does it necessarily matter as much who's occupying the Oval Office, or is it broader than that when you think about 2025?
Oh my God, I think there's a reset regardless of who wins the White House. But I also think that where we need to focus on is on the down ballots. So we've had, Trump say that he is all in on crypto, wants to make the US a Bitcoin capital. But we've also had Kamala Harris actually talk more and more about blockchain cryptocurrency, looking at it from a US competitiveness perspective. So that's encouraging. We'll have a reset. But what does that reset mean for the industry, and what does it mean for policy? Over the last 15 plus years of crypto, things have changed on the policy side. But we've never had this much institutional players within the space. So when you look at how policy will change, market structure will certainly be part of the conversation, but we're going to see more banks, more of Wall Street want a piece of the pie. And what does that mean for the crypto native space that have been really battling with the SEC and the CFTC on regulatory clarity?
Yeah, and Tiffany, that's a good point that Cleve brings up, because it's one thing to be all in crypto, or one thing to protect innovation within the United States as it relates to that space. But, securities regulation, enforcement, policymaking, it's not easy. It takes a lot of work. So how do you see it evolving?
That's correct. I mean, so the SEC, the agency that regulates the securities industry, is an independent agency, right? So no matter what happens in November, it's independent. But with that being said, I think with all the momentum that Cleve mentioned, I think there is appetite to see some changes. The SEC does have exemptive authority that it could use to create a regulatory framework along with the CFTC for the crypto industry. And so with all of this new interest and the bipartisan support for crypto, I think we're getting to a place where the SEC, whoever's leading it, could ask itself whether or not it makes sense to continue proceeding in litigation, or whether instead a different approach should be taken.
Yeah, and that's a challenge that's existed in the space for quite some time, is regulation via enforcement. Pelle, another challenge with regulation as well, not only are we looking at multiple jurisdictions within the United States, cohesive global regulatory frameworks also presents a challenge because of all these jurisdictions that we're operating in. Tell us about some of those challenges and how you see it evolving.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Like back in 2013, the US actually under Obama set the framework for regulatory clarity for crypto companies when they released their initial guidance. And this helped kick off Coinbase, Kraken, and all of these other large successful companies in the US today. Then later at around 2020, they set the stage. The US now under Trump, FinCEN, Treasury pushed internationally for these things to be standardized. And that has actually been a huge success story. While I'm American, I live here in Switzerland, and I'm working with a lot of companies in Europe and the UK, Asia, etc. And they have that regulatory clarity now. And traditional, crypto native companies are working with traditional finance institutions hand in hand. All the local banks here in Switzerland, for example, are now offering Bitcoin, stablecoin, Ethereum together as a partnership with some of the local crypto institutions because there's regulatory clarity. So I think it's a shame that the US, who really brought the first steps towards regulatory clarity to the world, is not pushing this forward, because the clarity and standardization that's happening, it still presents headaches for sure for companies who operate internationally. But the fact that these are being somewhat standardized globally is really helping the business and the industry take off.
Yeah. Tiffany, there's a couple things to unpack here. Explain to the audience why we can't necessarily plug and play digital assets into existing framework, one. And then number two, I also think it's fair to point out the way American legislation evolves, it isn't quite as simple as just plugging it into a new framework.
Yep. Yes. Happy to address that. So first, crypto assets themselves are very different from the traditional securities markets, right? They trade 24/7. They're a global asset class. And so in order for the crypto companies to register under the current regulatory framework, the SEC or even the CFTC would actually need to work with the industry to create a framework that works for crypto. For example, if you were going to register a crypto asset, you need to provide financials. Most crypto companies do not have financials, right? And so a regulatory framework needs to be tailored for crypto. And so the SEC could use its executive authority to actually provide that tailoring, but it has not done so yet. With respect to the global framework, the issue is, one, like the SEC in the US, unlike other jurisdictions, we have multiple regulators. So it's not a matter of just the SEC by itself creating a regulatory framework or using executive authority. Instead, we need to work with the other regulators, including the CFTC, potentially the banking industry, the banking agencies, to figure out the regulatory framework for the industry.
Right. And it's a great point that you bring up, because financial services, of course, is one of the most heavily regulated industries in the US. But I think it's worth pointing out here, Cleve, you have noted that there are there's billions of people around the world that use digital assets in a way to help build the local economy. And sometimes we tend to think very Western centric, but there are, in fact, people in the Caribbean, in the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, who are building economies with these different forms of capital formation.
Yeah, and that goes back to the need for regulatory clarity, because in order for the US to be globally competitive, we have to have that, because the nations across the world that weren't big economic nations before are now being competitive. When you look at the Caribbean region, the continent of Africa, Latin America, you've seen the largest adoption of digital assets within those regions, and you've seen those governments change their laws and create regulatory sandbags to attract large companies. And here in the US, we're still fighting over what's a security, what's a commodity. And, as Tiffany outlined, regardless of whether or not we actually, if Gensler hands in his resignation come January or February of 2025, we're still going to have so many other issues to deal with. How do we ensure that crypto native entities have access to banking rails, right? How do we hold institutional players accountable in the same way that we're holding, crypto native companies accountable? But at the end of the day, it is a global competitiveness issue because, again, the Caribbean, the UAE, the continent of Africa, Latin America, they're already so far ahead. And in order to really ensure that small businesses and entrepreneurship can grow here, we have to ensure small businesses can innovate and access emerging technologies.
Right. Pelle, do you think that's a function of the US and, Western Europe as an example? We have existing legacy financial frameworks in place, which is why other areas around the world have been able to leapfrog that. You have to think about how central banks are, where they're going to fit within this ecosystem, how the regulators, how the agencies, how legislators. I mean, we have this existing framework that we either need to, we have to think about how we're going to integrate that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, but I actually don't think it's necessarily the complexities of the existing regulation. I think Tiffany pointed out, there are these multiple different agencies. That's a really big differentiator. Switzerland was out front in 2016 and worked on getting crypto companies to come here. MiCA in the EU, the stated goal of it is to bring more, not just crypto business within the EU, but more financial services globally. So the countries are looking at it. How do we compete with the US? People are looking at it as an opportunity. And we speak with people all over the world, with regulators, central banks, where this is the goal of what they want to do. They're looking at it as a business decision for their country to do this. And unfortunately, the complexities of the US multi-regulator system just makes this complex. And also it's somehow managed to get pulled into party politics, which I don't think it needs to be there. As I mentioned before, the US was so great in the beginning that two different parties were pushing this forward, and then it just stopped, right?
Well, and which is so interesting, Tiffany, because this is actually one of the issues where there seems to be bipartisan support. But I'm going to ask you a question. We had Commissioner Hester Peirce on the show this Monday, and she, of course, she's one of the commissioners who advocates for digital assets. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked her. Are the regulators and agencies working together collectively, or is it more they're operating in silos as they're trying to figure out what the regulatory framework is going to look like?
So they seem to be working in silos, right? There was an executive order for digital assets a few years ago. It was actually told all the agencies to work together to come up with a framework, but that hasn't happened. Instead, you've seen the agencies use their existing powers individually to bring actions. And you really haven't seen anyone try to come out and use a regulatory framework. A good example of this is with respect to the SEC, they haven't put out any guidance about crypto since 2019 under Jay Clayton. That means under Chair Gensler, we have zero guidance about crypto, right? And so this could be different. And I think that goes to Cleve's point about there being a reset. Now that we have both them and Republican support, we're at a place where the industry is more mature and we can have a different result going forward.
Yeah, that's a great point that you make. I mean, 2019, that's nearly half the life of this particular asset class, and it has evolved so much for a number of reasons in the past 5 years, nearly 6 years. Cleve, do you think anything comes out of FIT 21 or any of the new legislation that's been introduced?
Yeah, and I want to pick up where Tiffany left off of the silos. The reset, I think, will change, not just because of where regulators are or, who occupies the White House. I think we have a new generation of legislators within Congress that are coming in. When you look at Shamari Figures or Julie Johnson, or even some of the existing ones, Mary Perez, Mary Peltola, and others. Why that's important is because we need Congress to create laws that would actually provide the guidance for regulators to change. And I think we have some new members of Congress that are going to focus on market structure, and whether that's FIT 21 or what Stabenow and others within the Senate have been thinking about. So I do think legislation has advanced quite a bit, but I think it's going to change significantly come this new Congress, because you do have, younger, newer members that are invigorated, that are really going to change the dynamic. Even when you look at FIT 21, the crypto industry is not even on the same page in terms of where that should be. Yes, it's a good step forward, but there are a lot of changes needed to that piece of legislation. And I think the industry is committed to working with new members of Congress to really get that bill where it needs to be and get the Senate in a place where we can actually move legislation.
Yeah, Cleve, that's a great point that you make, and perhaps a conversation for another time. But we seem to hear that theme across multiple industries where we're looking for legislation, not necessarily what's coming out of the agencies. But conversation for another time. I want to go back to Pelle. When we think about institutions and the crypto industry, based on the coverage that we've provided on Trade Talks, it seems as if we're talking more about integration and user experience and developing the global capital markets and moving forward, which to me suggests that the asset class itself is maturing. Would you agree with that? What are some of the advancements you're seeing in those terms?
Yeah, I agree 100% on that. And I think, for example, things like stablecoins. Stablecoins are taking over the world. It hasn't fully done it yet, but the amount of interest that we see from both banks, payment companies, crypto native companies, and even central banks on creating stable coins. A lot of the central banks are now thinking of it. How do they promote stable coins within their economies to push the economy forward? Stable coins is going to be a real driver of this, and that's also something that's relatively easily integratable with traditional payment systems and with traditional banking systems. So companies are looking at what the risks are, and so are regulators, but most of them are being solved. And I think bit by bit, as companies and regulators learn it, they're learning to see that this is a really good step forward because it solves so many issues with traditional payments. And I think Circle, for example, is doing a great job with USDC and EuroC on that front. But there are many others, and the amount of companies that we talk with who are focused on stablecoins is incredible, and it's really exciting to see that, because this is not about to the moon, making a ton of money overnight kind of thing. This is literally about payments. It's going to be more boring and beautiful than just functioning payments, right? Rather than all of this talk about, making a lot of money quick. And I think everyone can agree this is a good thing. And most regulators do.
And that goes back to the point that Cleve had made earlier in terms of, local economies are being grown around the world by billions of people. So it's not necessarily just a store of value or how much trading or how much money, they've made in it. But this is a form of commerce, which I think we need to catch up on. So Tiffany, in the last minute here, with that said, I see you're a member of the Wall Street Blockchain Association. I think they do fantastic work. You're a member of a number of other advocacy groups as well. How are you working with regulators and legislators to evangelize and advance the industry forward?
So I'm working with them to help them understand how the current market structure doesn't work for crypto, right? So there's been a call to come in and register. I'm helping them understand why that's impossible and what we actually need from a regulatory perspective for crypto companies to come in and register and comply with the applicable laws.
All right. Appreciate everyone's insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.